Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. My name's Rob, and today we're joined by author and Dr. Leonard Sax. He's the author of four primary books on parenting: Why Gender Matters, Boys Adrift, Girls on the Edge, and The Collapse of Parenting. Dr. Sax, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Give us a quick biography of your life and what got you into writing about parenting.
All right. So I attended public schools in Ohio, K through 12. I earned my undergraduate degree in biology at MIT. I earned my doctorate in psychology and my medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania. I did a residency in family medicine at Lancaster General Hospital in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I practiced family medicine in suburban Maryland for 19 years. I then took a 5-year sabbatical to visit schools across the United States and worldwide. I have visited now more than 500 schools over the last 24 years. I returned to clinical practice in Chester County, Pennsylvania in 2013, but I have continued to visit schools and lead workshops. I am still a part-time family doctor, but I also, as I said, continue to lead workshops for schools. So I didn't intend to be a writer. I intended to be a family doctor, but I started seeing a lot of boys coming into my office with a parent waving a note saying from the school, we're concerned about Justin or Damien or Carlos not doing well in school, not paying attention.
And what year would this have been?
This is the mid 90s. This is 30 years ago. Discovered very often that these boys did not have attention deficit disorder, that instead the school had no idea that boys and girls learn differently, and that the boys were disadvantaged. And I wrote an article for the American Psychological Association in 2001 titled Reclaiming Kindergarten, Making Kindergarten Less Harmful to Boys, because kindergarten had become more academic. In the 70s, kindergarten was about playing duck, duck, goose and finger painting and singing in rounds. And kids did not start to learn to read in the United States in the 1970s until first grade. Literacy was a first grade task in the United States in the 1970s. But in the 1990s, there was an acceleration of the kindergarten curriculum. And in the 1990s, literacy became a kindergarten
Do you think there
task.
was a change? Why do you think there was a changeover there?
Okay, well, I've written about that pretty extensively, and I think we know the answer to that question. During the Reagan administration, there was concern for most of the post-war era, beginning in the late 40s and through the 1970s. The United States led the world in every comparison of academic achievement. American kids were number one. Hard to believe now because we're all used to American kids lagging far behind. But for those of us old enough to remember the 60s and 70s, American kids actually were number one in academic achievement in math and science. Hard as it is to believe now, but it was true. But then in the late 70s and early 80s, Japanese kids pulled ahead in math and science. And the Reagan administration commissioned a study. What was going on? Why were American kids now number one in math and science, and Japanese kids number one, and American kids number two? That study was published and was titled A Nation at Risk, and got a huge amount of press, and said that this is a national security issue, that this should be a Sputnik moment, analogous to when the Russians launched the Sputnik satellite, that we should all be concerned that Americans were now number two in science, lagging behind the Japanese. And they said the problem begins in elementary school, that American kids beginning in kindergarten are just having fun. They're playing duck, duck, goose and finger painting and singing in rounds, while Japanese kids are doing math and science, that American educators and American school administrators need to be held accountable. Now, back in the 1970s, we had standardized tests, but only at high school. We did not ask second graders to do standardized tests. And the people who wrote A Nation at Risk said that has to change. We need to hold elementary school we need to hold elementary school administrators accountable. We need to introduce standardized tests into elementary school. We need to make elementary school rigorous and academic. And we did. That report, I argue, had huge consequences for American education and transformed American education. I emphasize that the transformation of American education that began with the Reagan administration, A Nation at Risk, early 80s, was driven not by academics, not by scholarly research, but by politics. And administrators said, look, if my tenure and my pay, literally, is going to be driven by these high stakes tests, if we're now going to be giving second graders standardized tests, and my job is going to be based on how well my second graders do on these tests, then first grade is too late to start kids to learn to read. We got to start kids reading in kindergarten. The acceleration of the early curriculum and driving the literacy curriculum into kindergarten was driven not by any study that suggested this would be a good thing to do, but by politics. And the idea of making 5-year-old boys sit still and be quiet and learn about phonics for an hour at 5 years of age, there was never any study that suggested this was a good thing to do. It was a reaction on the part of school administrators to a political initiative driven by a reaction to the fact that Japanese kids had pulled ahead of American kids. Now, that all happened 40 years ago, literally more than 40 years ago, when the United States had fallen to number 2. The United States is now number 33 worldwide. So we've fallen much farther. The reaction to that report has driven the United States much farther down in the international rankings because there was a profound misunderstanding of what was happening.
And so you started seeing boys in the 90s.
Yes.
Back to the original.
The acceleration of the early elementary curriculum was really exactly the wrong thing to do, and a profound misunderstanding of what was happening. So yeah, that happened long before we had the MRI scans showing that girls and boys mature differently, and that the language areas of a 5-year-old boy look pretty much like the language areas of a 3.5-year-old girl. It is not developmentally appropriate to ask a 3.5-year-old girl to sit still and learn about phonics. And it turns out it's not developmentally appropriate to ask a 5-year-old boy, for most boys, to sit still and learn about phonics for an hour at a time. And the result of making a demand that is not developmentally appropriate is that a lot of 5-year-old boys decide they're dumb and they hate school. And I recognize this in my 2001 paper entitled Reclaiming Kindergarten. And I suggested that we start boys 1 year later. If we're going to insist on teaching phonics in kindergarten, then we should enroll boys in kindergarten at age 6 rather than age 5. And to my great surprise, my article published in an obscure journal of the American Psychological Association was actually picked up by the National Post, one of 2 national papers in Canada, and then by the New York Times. And I was on TV talking about this idea, but it fizzled. It didn't actually go anywhere. And then 21 years later, Richard Reeves, a fellow at the Brookings Institution, wrote a book called Of Boys and Men. He said, I'm very concerned. Boys are lagging behind girls in academic achievement, but don't worry, I've come up with a brilliant idea. I know how to fix this problem. Let's enroll boys in school 1 year later than girls. He was not aware that I had made the same recommendation 21 years earlier. So anyhow, that's how your question was, how did I get into this? That's how I got into it. And that's when I started really visiting schools very seriously. And I posted lists of my school visits uh, going back to 2005 on my website.
You often quote the Shema several times in your work. I
Mm-hmm.
noticed that.
ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודך. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווה היום על לבביך. And these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart. Vishinantam livanecha. That next phrase is usually translated something like, teach them diligently to your children. Now, it would be easy to say that in biblical Hebrew. The verb there would be lamed, but the verb here is not lamed. The verb is shanen. Shanen does not mean to teach. Shanen means to chisel in stone. The Hebrew verb root is shane, which means tooth. So to incise, to inscribe, to chisel these words in the hearts of your children would be a better translation of that Hebrew phrase, Vishinantam Livnecha. You will find that exegesis of Deuteronomy 6 in my book, The Collapse of Parenting. And right alongside that exegesis, I cite a column by a longtime columnist for the New York Times, Jennifer Finney Boylan, who wrote a column on enlightened parenting in which she asserts that enlightened parenting means, and I quote, setting your child free to discover for themselves their own right and wrong. And if in so doing your child becomes a stranger to you, then so be it. Well, that may seem enlightened to some, but it is not enlightened. If you set your child free to discover for themselves their own right and wrong, and they have a device with internet access, what they will discover is Akon, Eminem, Cardi B, Megan Thee Stallion, Drake, Kendrick Lamar, mainstream pornography. Setting your child free to discover for themselves their own right and wrong is a dereliction of duty, and it's profoundly unhuman. What is childhood for? A 4-year-old is not a mature adult. A 4-year-old horse is. The Kentucky Derby is raced with 3-year-olds, and a horse is a larger animal than a human. So it can't be about biological maturity because, as I said, a 4-year-old horse is a mature adult, and a horse is a larger animal than a human. A human is developing for more years than most animals live. Why? Why does it take so long? We don't have to guess. We have scholars like Dr. Melvin Konner at Emory, who's devoted basically his entire career to addressing this question. He wrote an 800-page tome, The Evolution of Childhood, addressing this question, comparing development in our species with development in other species, especially other primates, The Evolution of Childhood, Oxford University Press. And the answer the scholars give is that it takes many years for parents to teach the child right and wrong. That's a defining characteristic of our species. The New York Times answer to set your child loose to discover for themselves their own right and wrong is not only an abdication of parental responsibility, it's profoundly unhuman. It's not what is in our DNA.
How does religion in general help bring up a child in the ways that the parents may not be able to without those religious tools or community or those type of assets?
So
I ask because
I have a presentation for parents called Evidence-Based Parenting, but it could also be titled Biblical Parenting, based on Deuteronomy 6. Vishidantam livanecha. Inscribe these laws, incise these laws in the hearts of your children. That is biblical parenting, and it turns out it's also evidence-based parenting, because we have scholars like Diana Baumrind who found that the best parents are authoritative parents, parents who inscribe their laws in the hearts of their children. But in the years leading up to her death in 2018, she expressed her concern that American parents are becoming permissive parents, that they no longer inscribe their laws in the hearts of their children, that they increasingly think that good parenting means letting kids decide. And over 50 years of research, she found that permissive parenting results in kids who are anxious and depressed. And indeed, over the last 20 years, we've seen a surge in the proportion of kids who are anxious and depressed, just what Diana Baumrind would predict.
Because of school closures under COVID policies, homeschooling has exploded and has only continued to rise. What does the data say about that environment? Is it good? Is it bad? Mixed in
I
general?
don't know that we can argue that we have real data. Science begins with well-controlled studies. Uh, Good science, you have to have a controlled study. And a controlled study of homeschooling would require that you randomly assign kids either to schooling, public schooling, or homeschooling, and no such study could be performed. You cannot randomly assign kids to such a study. So I don't know that we can use the term data here. However, I can certainly tell you as a family doctor that I've seen many, many kids who were struggling in a traditional school setting who have thrived in a homeschooling setting. And I do encourage parents whose kids are struggling in a school setting, if they can consider homeschooling, to do so. However, the majority of parents cannot consider homeschooling. In order to consider homeschooling, you have to have, number one, two parents at home, which eliminates a big chunk of families. You have to have a family that can survive on one income, which eliminates a much larger proportion of families. And you have to have a family where the stay at home parent is motivated and capable of homeschooling. So, really, only a small proportion of families can consider homeschooling. So, homeschooling is not an option for the great majority of families, which is why I don't even discuss it in any of my books, because it just doesn't make sense to devote space in a book to an option that's not an option for the great majority of your readers. It's every line in your book should be relevant to the great majority of your readers. And there is no point to devoting even one paragraph to an option that is not an option for 80% of your readers.
And now a break to hear from one of our sponsors. Are you tired of stepping in your dog's backyard landmines? Are you unable to pick up after them, don't have time, or simply don't want to? Let Scoopity-Doo take care of it for you. They scoop when you can't. Please see the show notes for contact information. And now, back to the episode. Moves on to the next question. And what are some moderate and realistic reforms for K through 12 education that you would like to see? If we can't do homeschooling and a child is having a problem in what is currently maybe not a great environment, as we've discussed for kindergarten or first or second or third grade, what are some reforms you would like to see that are?
Well, I think one realistic option is for school administrators to offer gender-aware instruction. And this kind of my specialty. I've learned a great deal from visiting more than 500 schools and sitting in a great many classrooms. I've learned that the best way to get boys excited about Jane Eyre and Emily Dickinson is very different from the best way to get girls excited about Jane Eyre and Emily Dickinson. I've learned that the best way to get girls excited about computer coding and physics and engineering is very different from the best way to get boys excited about computer coding and physics and engineering. And it costs nothing to accommodate these differences. You don't need single-sex classrooms. You don't need different instructional materials. You just need a little professional development to help teachers accommodate these differences. And you can do this with literally 2 days of professional development. And suddenly the boy who loves video games and football loves Jane Eyre and Romeo and Juliet, literally. And the girl who loves Ariana Grande and fashion design loves computer coding and loves physics. This is not a guess. I can share these stories with any school administrator who's interested, and with pictures of the boys and girls who have literally transformed. So these are low cost interventions that can achieve big gains.
You've often focused on the importance of self-control for happiness and later in life. When should we start to see self-control in kids, and what are some practical ways for parents to teach self-control throughout different age groups and life stages?
I think you need to start teaching self-control very early, and the way you teach self-control is very simple and intuitive, and I think every parent knows it. No dessert until you eat your vegetable. No games until the chores are done and the homework is done. That's how you teach it.
Simple, easy. Um,
It's simple, but it is not easy.
that is also true. I have three under seven, and they whine and complain. They want to watch their show. They want to go outside and play with their friends, but they gotta clean in the room or pick up the toys. And yeah, it cannot be easy. It's actually a lot easier for them to go out and play, and you pick up and pick up and pick up because it can be crying child can be quite grating. Very understandable. As I said, I'm a dad of three. How should dads train their sons to be an Atticus Finch or even a Maximilian Kolbe, someone who is loving and kind, but also makes strong moral choices in the face of adversity? I guess to ask in another way, how can we ward our sons off from envying the Tate brothers?
We want to train boys to be men. And unfortunately, I'm seeing more and more men who want to be boys, who want to play video games with their 10-year-old sons and are asking their 10-year-old sons to teach them how to play video games. That's a bad idea. Fathers, you want to teach your sons how to do things that you know how to do well. Teach boys to be men. Don't teach men to be boys. Men don't try to be boys. And you cannot teach a virtue which you do not yourself possess. So to be a better father, you have to be a better man. I was speaking to third graders about the importance of a good night's sleep. When I meet with students, it's always question and answer. And one of the boys raised his hand and he said, "My dad stays up past midnight playing Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto." And that kind of comment just breaks my heart. How is this boy supposed to learn any kind of self-control or self-constraint when his father is staying up late at night playing video games? He won't. That is a real cause for concern that I see many young parents who are not exercising self-control, who are not being good role models. We cannot hope their kids to develop these virtues if their parents do not demonstrate these virtues.
Be almost the same answer to my next question, which was how can their dads influence daughters to be like Abigail Adams or Jane Eyre, someone who's empathetic and a strong and equal better half, as it were, but also self-assured. You have a whole book about girls literally on the edge. I guess asked another way, how do we stop our daughters from emulating the Kardashians or Megan the Stallion or staying on TikTok and looking at beauty videos?
Parents cannot do this alone. You need to find, or if necessary, create a community of women for girls and a community of men for boys. In writing my books, I have reached out to comparative anthropologists, researchers who've spent their lives studying how other people have lived in other times and other places. And there is no successful civilization in which parents do this by themselves. Communities that civilizations that flourish have a community of men for boys and a community of women for girls. And we used to do that. American culture used to have strong communities, strong bonds across generations. And we've lost that as a culture. So I encourage parents. Maybe your church offers that, or maybe you can help your church to reclaim that. Bonds across generations, activities across generations. You need to create a community of women for girls, a community of men for boys, not just father-daughter, father-son, not just mom and daughter, but a community of women for girls, a community of men for boys.
How can parents navigate the evolving relationship during the teenage years? I guess asked in another way, what are some helpful tips to keep a strong bond of a parent-child relationship as that begins to change over, maybe 10 years, right? 12 to 22 or a little bit earlier, a little bit less maybe, but
So I devote a chapter of my book, The Collapse of Parenting, this topic, and the chapter is titled Joy. Joy, Joy. And my answer is you need to find fun things that you do with your teenager. And it should be something that you enjoy doing. So I've always enjoyed sailing. I learned to sail at summer camp when I was a kid. And I don't own a sailboat, but there's a state park near our home, Marsh Creek State Park, where you can rent a sailboat for $50. And my daughter and I have gone sailing on many occasions. And when we did that most recently, it was very gusty. They shouldn't have allowed us out, but they did. And we went out and we capsized. And the rigging that should have allowed us to right the boat was defective, so we were not able to get the boat back up. They had to come out and rescue us. And my daughter told me it was the most fun she'd ever have. We went flying through the air. The catamaran literally
Corkscrew almost.
corkscrew in the air and threw us in the air. We went flying. Yeah, it was pretty wild. No video available, unfortunately, but yeah, it was pretty amazing. You prioritize doing fun things with your teenager. You make time to do that kind of stuff with your kid.
I assume
Um,
even if they just maybe sometimes like a 3 to
even if they
5 year
don't
old,
want to,
even if they push back,
even
right?
if they push back, that's required. Yep.
You've written a review on Abigail Schreier's book on the dangers of therapy for children. What the book critiques a lot of progressive leaning of that occupation. Just give us a rundown of your review for our listeners.
So Abigail Schreier wrote a book called Bad Therapy, in which she basically attacks psychotherapy for kids and says you shouldn't take your kid to a therapist. She opens her book by saying that there's a very small minority of kids who actually need therapy, and this book doesn't apply to that very small minority. Nowhere in her book does she address the question of what kid is in that small minority. She assumes it's very easy to tell. Abigail Schreier is a lawyer who has worked as a journalist. She has no clinical training. And she has no clue what she's talking about. She's profoundly ignorant of all clinical matters, as becomes embarrassingly obvious when you read her book from a clinical perspective. I'm a medical doctor. I also have a PhD in psychology. She has no knowledge of medicine or psychology at all, as she makes embarrassingly obvious throughout her book. The legal term is duty of care. A medical doctor has a duty of care. If I make a recommendation, if a mom says to me, Doctor, do you think I need to be concerned? And I say, no, you don't need to be concerned. And then her daughter commits suicide the next day, I'm liable. Abigail Schreier, as a writer, has no duty of care. She says you don't need to be concerned. You should not take your daughter to see anybody. If a mom follows that advice and her daughter commits suicide, Abigail Schreier is not liable. She's writing a book for the general public. She has no duty of care under law. Her book is irresponsible in the extreme. She has no clue what she's talking about. She repeatedly says to parents over and over again, if your kid is unhappy and struggling, don't take him to a therapist. They'll just make it worse. When I speak to parents, on this topic, I talk about a high school girl who was a straight A student, who was extremely popular, beautiful. I show pictures of this girl. Her name was Madison Halloran. Very popular, very beloved, state champion, soccer player, state champion, track star, recruited to the University of Pennsylvania, beloved by everyone, but told her parents that she was not enjoying the University of Pennsylvania, wanted to quit track. Her parents asked if she wanted to transfer. She didn't know. Her track coach said, "Look, you're doing well. You're actually one of the fastest kids on the team, and you're doing actually very well in your studies. Don't quit. You can cut back if you want. We'll accommodate you, but don't quit." And she committed suicide. Who needs help and who doesn't? It's actually one of the hardest questions to answer as a family doctor. Abigail Schreier doesn't have a clue. She has no idea what she doesn't know. Her book is astonishingly ignorant and immensely harmful. and she doesn't even know.
Thank you for that heartfelt critique, especially with that story. As we're nearing the end of the interview, is there anything you're working on right now? Is there anything that you would want to share with our listeners just in general?
Yeah, I'm writing a third edition of my book, Boys Adrift. First edition was published back in 2007. Was reviewed in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA. It got a very good review, except that they said, the evidence that boys are falling behind is not that persuasive. Well, it's a lot more persuasive now. There's really not much debate that boys are falling behind. Second edition was published 2016, and the publisher said, it's time for a third edition, which I agree. The subtitle is The 5 Factors Driving the Growing Epidemic of Unmotivated Boys and Underachieving Young Men. But in the third edition, there will be a sixth factor, and that is pornography. Now, I mentioned pornography in the first two editions. Pornography has changed. It's become much more addictive. Artificial intelligence now allows boys to customize a girlfriend to their exact tastes. It has really changed, and it has become much more addictive. So if any parent has a story they'd like to share about a boy who was adrift and has transformed, or if any young man would like to share his story of how he came back and is willing to share his story for the new edition, by all means, reach out. Go to my website, leonardsax.com, and get in touch with me.
I will put that link below in the show notes for anyone listening.
I'm doing a bunch of interviews right now. The revised edition is due October 1 at the publisher, so I've got plenty of time yet, and I'm learning a lot as I prepare the new edition.
Well, Dr. Sax, thank you so much for this interview and for all your answers. And we'll
Thanks.
We'll see everyone next week on Church Coffee.
Very good. Thank you for the invitation.
Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.